When I first came to the United States, I was 20 years old and working as an au pair. I didn't have much experience, but I was eager and very nervous. I grew up in a small town in France and had never spent time away from home, let alone across an ocean. My English still needed work, but I was confident enough to get by. I expected it to be a good year, a new adventure, a cultural exchange, something I'd tell my friends about when I went home. I was matched with the Joseph family. I won't name the exact town for privacy reasons, but it was an upper-middle-class neighborhood, quiet streets, nice houses, big backyards. The kind of place you'd expect to find well-behaved kids, PTA moms, and dads who worked non-stop. I remember being so relieved when I first arrived. I thought, this will be easy. Nothing bad happens in places like this. The Josephs had 2 boys, Brock and Brandon. Brock, the older one, was 12. He was a pretty typical kid, kind of lazy, sometimes rude, but harmless overall. He made jokes, liked his Xbox, and mostly stayed out of trouble. Brandon, though, was different. He was 9 and already had this coldness to him. I don't know how else to describe it. There was something off. I think it's likely he had some kind of social disorder. When I first met him, he just stared at me without saying a word, not shy or embarrassed, just staring like he was studying me. After a few seconds, he smiled and asked, "Are you the maid?" I laughed awkwardly and said I was going to help look after him and his brother for the year. He didn't laugh with me. He just kept watching. It didn't take long to realize Brandon wasn't like the other kids. My host parents warned me that he was difficult. They said he had a bit of an attitude, but that was the understatement of the century. Brandon didn't just have an attitude, he was mean. And I don't mean the usual bratty stuff like teasing his brother or refusing to eat what he was served. It was worse than that. He lied constantly about everything. He once told his teacher that Brock tried to choke him in the kitchen, which never happened. He told the neighbor that his parents locked him in a closet at night. He even told me that the last au pair ran away because of him and that she was never seen again. When I tried to scold him for it, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Don't tell me what to do." Everything was manageable for me, even at that point, but I do admit that I was a little frightened of him. Things only got worse from there. One night, about 2 months in, I pulled back my sheets and froze. There were thumbtacks scattered all over my mattress. I just stared for a second, dozens, maybe 100 of them, pointing upward, waiting for me to lie down. My heart started racing. The mattress cover had tiny punctures everywhere. I stood there in fear, realizing how close I'd come to lying on them. Brandon had been spying on me earlier that day. I'd caught him peeking through a crack in the door when I was folding clothes. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed he was being nosy. But after seeing all those thumbtacks, I wasn't so sure. I was honestly so scared I didn't want to tell his parents, afraid that they'd send me back to France. So I cleaned up the mess and kept it to myself. After that, things became more and more strange. Brandon started following me around the house. I'd catch him peeking around corners, watching me from the doorways. Sometimes, when I was cooking or reading, I'd look up to find him sitting across the room, staring without blinking. I never said anything. I must admit, I tried to avoid him as much as I could out of fear. One afternoon, I was watering flowers in the garden when I smelled something off, a sharp, sour odor, like something rotting. I traced it to a corner of the yard where the soil looked freshly disturbed. I was curious, so I grabbed one of those little garden shovels and started poking at the soil. When I saw what was there, I nearly screamed. There were 3 dead rabbits buried there. Their bodies were twisted and cut in several places. One had its legs tied together with string. I ran inside to tell my host parents. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph looked concerned at first, until they pulled Brandon aside to ask him about it. He gave an innocent look and said it wasn't him. That was it. They believed him. Mrs. Joseph said it was probably one of the neighborhood kids and told Brandon to go back inside. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked after that. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow near my bed. It was Brandon. He was standing there, holding something. I blinked a few times and realized what it was, a kitchen knife. I screamed as loud as I could. By the time the parents came rushing in, The knife was gone. Brandon had shoved it under the bed. He convinced them that he'd been sleepwalking. Mrs. Joseph gave me an annoyed look, as if to say, "Why are you making such a fuss?" I pointed to the knife handle sticking out from under the bed and pleaded with them to believe me. Mr. Joseph knelt down, pulled it out, and showed it to Brandon. He just smiled and said he had never seen it before, and they, of course, believed him. I told them that my door had been locked, so he must have picked it, but they told me that was nonsense. I felt so alone. I had no one. I didn't know what to do. For better or worse, a decision was made for me. The next morning, Mrs. Joseph called me to the living room and said I had stolen her jewelry. I was completely confused, until she held up a pearl necklace I had never seen before. She told me she had found it in my purse, which she was holding in her other hand. I begged her to believe me that I hadn't stolen it, but there was nothing I could say to convince her. Brandon stood in the hallway, smiling to himself. I knew it was him. They fired me on the spot. I flew back to France the next day. I couldn't believe how easily Brandon had destroyed my life. 4 months afterward, I was extremely depressed. I thought I had blown my one chance at living in the US and feared I wouldn't get another one. Fortunately, I found my way back to the States several years later and still live here. I have a good job and good friends. I still think about Brandon from time to time. I can only imagine the evil person he's grown up to become.